Ioseb's last legitimate child Judith had already been told by her mother Donna Podolsky to decline everything her father Ioseb left her if he died, and she was approached about the estate. When Russian officials approached her in 1980, she didn't even think about it. She immediately declined everything officially and got nothing. She didn't even give a thought to what she could have received potentially. She said her psycho mother Donna told her to refuse, so she did without question. She had already been divorced by my father Kevin, had a hysterectomy shortly after I was born, and was not around me in any way when she declined collecting her inheritance off her father Ioseb. In context, her declining everything except cash would have made more sense. Her taking nothing is one of those decisions she chose to make. That final decision on my mother Judith's part meant that everything left over from Ioseb's Stalin estate that was not distributed to another beneficiary became my sole property via his estate document. It all would have been under Russian law as his only legitimate grandchild anyway. Including his personal assets, shares and bonds, belongings, and around 4 dozen properties. Everything left apart from the cash Svetlana took. Those Soviet Union officials tried to talk my mother out of it in a 4-hour-plus meeting. But she insisted she wanted nothing like her mother told her to. I would like to point out here that my mother declining to accept what her father left her did not include a decline on my behalf at age 8. Judith did not have the right to decline my inheritance on my behalf. Regardless of me being legally in her custody, but with an imposter, after the divorce court order. All of my Russian Djugashvili estate inherited from my grandfather Ioseb, Stalin, was legitimately and legally accumulated by him. That includes any gifts from his mother Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorova and her royal Romanov family. Right in the middle of all of that was an event in Russia. The 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, which began on the 19th of July, 1980. I had been the third beneficiary in my grandfather Ioseb's estate documents since 1975. They had 5 years to plan everything. They tried to intellectually vomit at me whilst the games were in progress, always incorrectly thinking I would watch every last second I could get to see on television in Gippsland because I inherited a huge estate there. They never factored in the idea that the games would not be a priority for me to watch on television at the time, including due to experiencing family grief at the death of multiple family members in the previous few years. Kaiser Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern watched some on television when living in his house around 7 kilometers from my family home in Yarragon. I'm sure he was suitably disgusted, including at both Germany's little cameos and displays. I hardly even bothered. Such a smart choice in someone as young as me is still something I am quietly proud of. I'm not sure if anyone nicknamed the Moscow Games the torture the 8-year-old Olympics or not. They always assumed I would watch every second, even in the middle of the night at age 8. My grandfather and my auntie Svetlana had both already died before the games. I don't know what date my mother was approached and declined her inheritance, as she had already been divorced by my father, who won the court case, but it was during 1980. The 1980 Moscow Olympics was, to put it mildly, an absolute propaganda disgrace aimed almost solely at 8-year-old me, the sole remaining beneficiary of my grandfather Ioseb, Stalin, Djugashvili's estate in Russia, and the Prince Imperial of the Hohenzollern Constitutional Monarchy of Germany since December 1977. And an eligible future Duke and Lord of Austria and Hungary whose web family had been illegally deprived of access to the Habsburg royal family estate since 1960. I have always struggled to put my disgust about it into words. The longer assets are illegally withheld, the more insane they get about people turning into puppets in front of their eyes. The entire Moscow Olympics, from pre-games, boycott, discussions to the garbage cleaned up after the closing ceremony, was an attempt to terrorist threat bludgeon mesmerize me at age 8 into doing anything I was told to do by crazy Russians and people from other Soviet Union states, amongst others, whenever I was told to do it. Regardless of how disgusting, unnatural, or inappropriate the concepts were. With the intention of holding my estate ransom until I did. The vile concept of an 8-year-old watching on television being an easy target was emblazoned all over every last second of the intellectual vomit pumped out during the event. Australians had already been being violated by experimental unofficially launched Russian satellite weapons for the previous decade, including cheating against myself and my father Kevin's favourite Australian football team starting 1973, which had nothing to do with me at the time. I wasn't officially declared a beneficiary of my grandfather's estate until 1975. Australia, and others, were happy to play along with the boycott thing. The media publicized that Australia had officially boycotted the Moscow Games, but Australian athletes with convenient-sounding names in propaganda terms ended up going anyway and competing. Big boycott losers. It was all propaganda sewage. The boycott was probably an attempt to make me sob in distress at not seeing the games broadcast from the country I inherited a huge estate in. Then Australia sent athletes anyway. I call it the Australia's Got Principles curtain. It gets gruesome when someone pulls it open. Example, the footy. I watched very little, after being put off by the very few disgusting references to me I saw, that were enough. The entire opening ceremony, particularly the pathetic spectator flashcards picture display, was an attempt to threaten, mesmerize me into doing whatever I was told by crazy Russians and Soviets, whenever I was told, with violent threats included. Everything afterwards was more of the same, including some of the eventual results. It was the first truly propaganda-ruined satellite-affected games, and it looked as weakly intellectually pathetic and miserable as people said it was when they got home. I didn't bother to try to watch it at all after the Australian boycott come competing anyway media fake dust had settled. I am still disgusted. And both Australia and Russia are still disgusting over 40 years later. The fact it was all aimed at an 8-year-old child didn't cause any kind of intellectual filtering or restraint on the participants' part. It was like a propaganda stretch rack they wanted me to jump on for them so they could start cranking the gears. Some even thought there were threats to rape 8-year-old me immediately after the games if I didn't take it in and play along. It was the first attempt at Truman Show stalking at me. Australia lapped every second of it up, obviously. Mysteriously fielding athletes after a complete boycott was publicized on the media. I have not been naive in any way since, and I didn't even watch it. Pathetic trash that went to the opening ceremony in their 20s and 30s and held up flashcards to make pictures, knowing what they said to me, still traveled to Australia to stalk me in the street with foul language threats, corruption, and verbal abuse. Their motive is that I didn't behave like a frightened puppet after the games finished and do whatever intellectually and sexually disturbed Russian, Soviets and others told me to. In short, people involved in the 1980 Moscow Olympics, who are now elderly, still pretend they are allowed to torture me because I didn't behave like a programmable robot for Soviet lunatics starting 1981. Now elderly morons who held up flashcards at the 1980 Moscow Olympics to make threats to kill, rape and mutilate me in some people's opinions have waited for me at train stations in Victoria, Australia as recently as 2024. They vilified me as I walked past, then pretended I had to attempt sex with a Russian female lunatic descended from someone who appeared in the television footage of the opening ceremony in 1980 afterwards, implying that the lunatic female involved would look like the mascot from the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Some of them don't even look at me when claiming to speak to me, or at me, they just stare at the nearest available camera, or up to the sky in the direction of a satellite. There is no way for me to express myself about it fully yet, so I'll give up and move on. I am over 15 hours right, and they are still pretending they are waiting for me to follow propaganda instructions broadcast at me during the 1980 Moscow Olympics. As if they have been leaning forward in anticipation watching since 1980, waiting for it to work and me to do their thing like a robot for them. They are a lost cause and a very violently disturbed lost cause in the 2000s at that. They have attempted to force me to sexually pick up and have immediate sex with a female dressed up to look like a mascot from the 1980 Moscow Games as recently as 2024. The Soviet Union claimed to win around 80 gold medals at the Games of 195 medals in total. The Games were held the year after my grandfather Ioseb, Stalin, died and after my auntie Svetlana died. I inherited my grandfather Ioseb's estate in 1981, but still haven't accessed it, due to it being illegally withheld despite court rulings beyond appeal and Russia confirming it is rightfully mine and cannot be frozen. The nominally labeled communist GDR of East Germany, which statistics I have seen suggest had a population of less than 17 million at the time, came second on a bizarre 47 gold medals of 126 total medals won. The next best tally of gold was 8. Boycotts were listed as a factor in that number. My great-grandfather and predecessor, former Kaiser Prince Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern, was living around 7 kilometers from my family home in my hometown of Yarragon in Gippsland at the time and watched some of the Moscow Games on television in his house off Hazeldean Road, which I inherited as well. He had already officially abdicated to me in December 1977. Some people thought there wasn't a single woman representing the GDR amongst their female athletes, and their results have been repeatedly parroted the world over since 1980. Some people take sport less seriously now than then, with more modern satellite terrorism techniques involved. It was completely unrecognizable as competitive sport in most people's opinions, apparently. Glad I missed it. Russia should really have another go at hosting a more sporting-themed Olympics, not trying to blame me in any way for the 1980 version being ruined by lunatics in response to the death of my grandfather Ioseb. Them claiming they have illegally withheld my Djugashvili estate because I haven't done a list of things they tried to mesmerize me into doing during the 1980 Moscow Olympics, with threats of murder, mutilation, and disfigurement thrown in, is not a valid excuse for withholding my assets. There was an in-out, bundled, indefinite excuse routine mapped out as to why they, Soviet Union officials, didn't contact me in 1981 about being sole remaining beneficiary of my grandfather Ioseb's estate. I was in his estate document and it was official, but they pretended I was outside of it, as it was more inconvenient and the only eligible beneficiary under base Russian law as his only legitimate grandchild instead. The element of doubt thing. Then they pretended the Djugashvili estate had to be, incorrectly, bundled with me being the only person possibly technically eligible to inherit the Romanov estate and become the next Tsar of Russia. It was so they could claim I couldn't possibly receive the Romanov estate until the 2 remaining Romanov children's remains were found and identified from their murder in 1917 and a thorough investigation completed to confirm my technical eligibility, and if they pretended the 2 were bundled, then I would be deprived of access to my Djugashvili estate until the Romanov children's bodies were found and identified. Until those 2 bodies were found, it was possible one or both survived and had children, so they had to wait for the element of doubt to be erased. As if I wasn't really in the estate document directly, and the gossip would make people forget that bit saying I was. The 2 remaining bodies were found and identified in 1991 via DNA testing, and it was just after Germany reverse theatrically reunified. Which was semi-grotesque from my point of view as their Prince Imperial. That is another book by itself. When they started up with the wall tumbling thing, I lost interest fairly quickly based on the very little I actually saw in Australia. Some people have bizarrely insane expectations about how much television an individual can watch a day. They still behave as if I should be able to watch about 100 hours a day worth, metaphorically speaking. The last child conceived with my stolen sperm was born in 2018, around 9 months after the last of my stolen sperm was destroyed. My mother Judith, the only remaining child of Ioseb, dropped dead suddenly shortly afterwards. A final death certificate was written, a copy sent to Russia, leaving only me, officially. Yet another set of families I am the last legitimate member of. Females who sporadically pretended to be my mother when I was a child started queuing up to pretend to be my mother. They packed their bags as if waiting for the okay to head to Russia and illegally move into one of the properties that are all rightfully mine under Russian law. One of the laws they claim is a pillar of their stability as a nation they will not compromise on, with a clenched fist and a pounding arm. Yet another pack of lunatics with floor plans, photographs, rooms picked, and their bags packed pretending all I have to do is play along and it will be theirs. Even though they never actually approach me at all. They'll get nothing. In Russia, the right to buy properties that meet strict guidelines can be sold to a Russian citizen. It is officially the right to be the first person offered the opportunity to buy a property if the owner ever sells it. It usually costs a large percentage of the market value of the property to purchase the first offer rights, which is not refundable. The money is used to fund those little propaganda-looking parties with the microphone, the extended dinner table, karaoke, multi-course meal, entertainment, those guys from Pussy Riot, for example, amongst other things. The person who purchases that right then has to pay a minimum of market value again when the property gets sold, if it ever is. It's very expensive, and they tend to guard the properties like they are almost theirs afterwards, sometimes with weapons. There are people in Russia with guns saying, "Get off what could be my future property," there every week these days. They actually know my name, in some cases. The property owner, me officially in Russian law in this case, has no choice. If the owner wants to sell, the first rights to buy owner gets first crack at purchasing it. The owner gets told it's Russia's national foundations at stake here. If you don't want that person to buy it, simply never sell. Or wait for them to die. Simple. I still take offense at people claiming they take my Romanov DNA more seriously than me being a Hohenzollern officially. And vice versa, but that scenario rarely eventuates.